This is a brief lecture on trauma and the developing brain, specifically principles of brain development. I'm Dr. Carol Smith, and this should take just a few minutes. Here's some quick definitions that are helpful for you to remember. When we talk about trauma, we're talking about an experience that is bigger than a crisis, is bigger than stress. It is an experience that completely overwhelms one's ability to cope and is also marked by horror, helplessness, dread, or fear. Developmental trauma is the presence of trauma in a child's life, usually in a child's primary home, but it can also be within the child's larger family or their social sphere. But it's a trauma that happens during key developmental stages in a child's life. That's what we mean by developmental trauma. We talk about complex trauma to include developmental trauma, but also to include the complexities that can happen with trauma in somebody's life. For example, a person can be traumatized in the context of being an addicted person, or they could have more than one trauma happen, or they could have trauma happen as a child and then have another trauma happen as an adult, or they could have trauma happen in the context of a mental health disorder or a brain disorder or all of the above. So when we talk about complex trauma, we're including developmental trauma. And a lot of times these two phrases or terms are used interchangeably. When someone says complex trauma, they mean developmental trauma. But because I'm a stickler for details, the idea of complex trauma does include developmental trauma, but it also can include things beyond what happens in childhood. It's really helpful to understand principles of brain development specifically with children so that you can understand why trauma in childhood is so profound. When we talk about brain development, we're talking about a really complex dynamic situation. Brain development crosses multiple domains within the physiology of the brain, including cellular function, connections between systems within the brain, connections between the brain and the body, connections between the person who has the brain and other people, interpersonal interactions and how those affect development. It's incredibly complex. It's also very, very big. It involves billions of interactions across all of these various domains. It's also very dynamic. It involves sequences and patterns and interactions amongst these domains and across these domains. And there are multiple simultaneous processes going on at the same time, all the time. And there are particular critical windows where things are happening in a particular sequence for a youngster. And these are all very, very important that they happen on time and in order. And finally, everybody is completely unique based on all of these various moving pieces. Genes, personality, experiences, the nature-nurture thing, opportunities for things like learning experiences, stimulation, like of the senses, like if a person grows up in a very impoverished environment and there's not a lot of opportunity for sensory stimulation, that has an effect on their brain development. Or if someone who grows up in a very diverse situation and has lots and lots of things to look at, listen to, smell, taste, feel, those kinds of things, those do change the way the brain develops. And also you throw in the personal dispositions of the person. Are they inclined towards learning? Are they inclined towards exploration? Are they inclined towards others? Are they turned in on themselves? You know, all of these various dispositions, all of these affect how a young person's brain develops. The brain develops from the bottom up, both physically and functionally, meaning that it starts with the brainstem before birth and it moves on until you're around age 28, 29, 30, and then gradually declines very, very gradually over a person's lifetime. Brain deceleration doesn't really become noticeable until around age 60. And then from there, slowly but surely, we find ourselves having to do more and more things with more and more care, and not quite so automatically as we did when we were youngsters. It's also really important to understand that the brain develops sequentially, and you cannot disrupt that sequence or you're just going to run into trouble. And there are critical windows for those sequences. You've probably learned, for instance, there's a critical window for developing language. And if a youngster is not exposed to learning language during that critical window, they're going to have a really hard time learning how to speak ever. The higher levels do depend on the lower levels developing. So you can't mess up the sequence. You've got to go from the bottom to the top. And again, I spoke about the critical windows, and development concludes around age 30. It's hard to believe, but adolescent medicine actually includes age 29. So it's important to remember that a perfect brain takes time. When we talk about maltreatment hijacks this complex and elegant process. It increases the likelihood of dysfunction among all 6 of these domains. And this is really problematic. And this is what we tend to see in the classroom, where we have youngsters who have difficulty with things like motor coordination or speech production. They interact with others in maybe not so helpful ways. Their emotional regulation is a little hair trigger. Maybe they melt down very easily, they get angry easily, or they cry easily, or they're not emotional at all. They have a very flat affect. That is all indicators that the maltreatment may be happening in that child's life. Not completely, but they're indicators. Cognitive processing obviously is affected by maltreatment and brain development, and then behavioral regulation, being able to sit still, being able to pay attention, being able to follow rules, being able to do things in sequence. All of those things can be hijacked by maltreatment. When we talk about being trauma-informed and understanding brain development, we not only have to understand trauma, but we also have to understand development. We have to understand how children develop, how their brains develop. We have to understand the concept of critical windows. But we also have to factor in the notion of resilience and resilience factors. Those are incredibly important as well as the interplay between individuals and contexts, including things like substance abuse, attachment, neglect, poverty, community, the larger family, all of these things. We have to be able to take into account all of these various things in order to truly be effective as educators, as therapists, as adults who help youngsters. It's really important to understand the notion of a pair of ACEs. The first ACE is the Adverse Childhood Experience Study that was done in 1995 and 1996. If you have not yet become familiar with that, you really need to get familiar with what the ACE study was all about, because it's foundational and it helps us to understand trauma in a much more measurable way. In addition to that, we have adverse community environments, and it's important to understand those as well. Adverse community environments are things like community matters, communities that struggle with hopelessness, communities that don't have enough, communities where there's chaos or poverty or violence or any kind of traumatic stressors for all of their inhabitants. These adverse community environments do affect our children as well. Critical windows, I mentioned these before. These are developed in a predetermined order, and they cannot occur out of order. And they are vulnerable if disrupted, or if they're extinguished altogether, or if they're prevented from happening. Critical windows are periods of potential brain development that are critical to functionality and which are vulnerable in a young child. The same trauma will affect a young child much more profoundly, say in the first 1,000 days of life, than the exact same trauma would affect even a child who's 5 years old or a child who's 10 or 12 years old. The younger the child, the more the trauma affects them. The earlier in life that it happens, the more vulnerable that child is to not only to the effect of that trauma, but it also makes that child more vulnerable to future traumatic incidents, less able to manage them and manage them well. In a perfect scenario, a child would meet all their developmental milestones on time and in order because all of that child's critical windows have been nurtured and fostered by caring and consistent and attached caregivers. That's the perfect scenario, and that's what we hope for every child. Timing is everything regarding traumatic stress. The earlier a trauma occurs, the worse it is. The longer a trauma endures, the worse it is. The more a trauma is specifically directed at a child, as opposed to a child being around when a bad thing happens, like a house fire or something like that. If it's directed personally, abusively at a child, the more pervasive its consequences are. And this idea of malleability is really important to understand. Very, very young brains are quite malleable, but they're also very vulnerable to trauma. A young brain, but older than very young, is less vulnerable, but it's also less malleable. And then finally, an old brain, like in an adult, is less malleable and then becomes more vulnerable again. So this idea of malleability is important for understanding development and developmental trauma. Early trauma is profound because of what's happening in the child's brain and mind and psyche at this critical stage in their growing up. A child is creating templates for his or her expectations about the world and others and his or her place in the world. Is the world safe? Are other people trustworthy and predictable? Do others provide safety and care? And then very profound questions about a youngster. Am I okay? Do I belong? Do I have agency or influence in my life or in my environment? The child is creating mental maps of the world and his or her place in it all the time during these critical developmental phases. And we have to be very, very aware of what's going on when we work with children. The implications for trauma in a developmental stage the implications are very profound. It is amazing to me. We've had 40 years of key findings in developmental neurobiology, but these findings are still not being consistently incorporated into things like pedagogy, how we teach, practice, how we interact with people, programs, how we work with youngsters, or public policy. These are all really important things, and they have our understanding of developmental neurobiology just hasn't happened very well yet and hasn't been integrated into these things very well. Our Volt certificate at Marshall does incorporate and integrate these implications into our pedagogy and practice, but you all, as graduates of Marshall and the Volt certificate, you're charged with integrating these into your programs and advocating for integration into public policy. These are the references that I referred to make this lecture. You're welcome to look up any of them that you want. I'm sure you're going to go running right out to the library and look these up. But if you are interested, these are well worth reading. And of course, if you have questions at all, don't hesitate to contact me. You can call me or email me, and you can even request a Zoom meeting, and I will Zoom with you. And that is our lecture. Thanks for listening.